Hey guys, and hi Emily. Tonight, we begin with a group of heavily armored men who solved most of their problems by swinging pieces of metal at each other. Medieval knights. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If medieval swords really worked the way movies claim, every knight would have walked onto the battlefield, smiling, confident, and probably humming a heroic theme song. Instead, most of them walked in thinking, if this sword is the only thing standing between me and death today, then I deeply regret every decision that brought me here. Let's start with the uncomfortable truth. The sword was not the star of the show. In fact, it was barely the supporting actor. Knights didn't want to use their swords. Using your sword meant that everything else had already gone catastrophically wrong. Your lance splintered, your spear snapped, your shield is somewhere behind you being trampled by a horse. And now you're standing in the mud, gripping 3 lb of metal like, yes. Plan Z, Hollywood sword fights looked graceful, like two ballerinas rehearsing a violent waltz. Real sword fights looked more like two exhausted construction workers, arguing with crowbars. Armor didn't politely open up when struck. It simply absorbed the blow and reminded you how unimportant your hopes and dreams were. Swinging a sword at plate armor was the medieval version of knocking on a door that would absolutely never open. And knights knew this. That's why they didn't try to slice armor. They tried to find the pathetic little spots where armor couldn't protect you, like the armpit, elbow gaps, throat openings, and the groin flap that absolutely no one wants to talk about. Medieval combat manuals are basically long, depressing lists of here are all the places where you can stab a man and ruin his day. One of the most charming and completely uncinematic techniques was half-swording, where a knight grabs his own blade with a gloved hand and uses it like a spear. Yes, he holds the sword by the blade. No, he doesn't chop his fingers off. Contrary to popular fantasy novels, a medieval sword's edge was not a laser razor designed by angry elves. It was sharp enough to hurt someone, but not sharp enough to destroy your hand the moment you touched it. Swords were reliable. Sure, they were status symbols. They looked great on your hip, but in battle, they were as comforting as a butter knife in a bear attack. They were the break glass in case of emergency option, usually followed immediately by the emergency breaking you. So, yes, swords are iconic. But remember, if a knight was using his sword, the universe had already failed him several times that day. If you've ever watched a medieval movie, you've probably noticed that no one, absolutely no one, ever grabs their sword by the blade. Why? Because Hollywood thinks medieval swords were glass-sharp laser beams capable of slicing atoms on contact. Meanwhile, real knights were gripping their blades mid-fight like they were trying to choke the sword into behaving. Welcome to half-swording, the medieval combat technique that instantly separates actual knights from fantasy cosplay enjoyers. The idea was simple. If you can't cut through armor, and you definitely can't, you turn your sword into a short spear, grab the middle of the blade with your gauntlet hand, and start aiming for tiny armored gaps like you're trying to thread a needle during an earthquake. Half-swording worked because medieval swords were sharp, yes, but not your fingers fall off if you touch it. Sharp, they were tools, not mythological artifacts. Knights wore thick leather gloves or plate gauntlets, which gave them better grip, protection, and just enough false confidence to attempt something that looks completely insane by modern standards. The whole purpose of half-swording was precision and desperation. You weren't swinging wildly anymore. You were guiding a stabbing point with surgeon-level intent, except you were not a surgeon. You were sweating inside a metal sauna and someone was trying to murder you while you did it. Medieval combat was basically operation but with consequences. Combat manuals from the 1400s are full of lovingly illustrated instructions, showing knights grabbing their blades, ramming them into armpits, prying open visors, and occasionally using the pommel like a hammer to encourage compliance. These were serious martial arts techniques, but they still make it look like two armored men were trying to fix a jammed printer with extreme violence. And let's be honest, half-swording also happened because medieval battlefields were depressing places. Mud, blood, screaming, and the sound of metal hitting metal for hours. Swinging a sword full force for that long wood. Turn your arms into wet noodles. Half-swording let knights conserve energy while still being unpleasantly efficient. Of course, you'll never see it in movies. Actors grabbing the blade would ruin the mystique. Plus, someone in the audience would scream. He'd cut his hand off while clutching their soda like a medieval combat expert. But real knights did it constantly, because medieval fighting wasn't about looking cool. It was about staying alive long enough to complain about it later. If swords were the polite handshake of medieval combat, then maces were the aggressive, bone-crunching greeting that said, "Hello, I would like you to stop being alive now." Knights didn't carry maces because they were stylish. They carried them because armor ruined everyone's fun. Once plate armor arrived on the scene, swords immediately filed complaints. Swords were excellent for stabbing fabric, slicing flesh, and looking dramatic on horseback. But they were absolutely useless against someone wrapped in several millimeters of forged steel. That's where the mace stepped in, wearing sunglasses and carrying a blunt object that looked like a medieval plumber's nightmare. A mace didn't cut, slice, or pierce. It hit hard. And hitting someone in armor with a mace is less finesse and more "let me introduce your skeleton to the concept of shockwaves." A well-placed mace strike could dent plate armor so badly that the poor victim would have to be extracted like a misaligned puzzle piece. Medieval chronicles politely described these injuries as significant, which is historian speak for the knight folded like laundry. Maces were intentionally simple. A stick, a weight, possibly some spikes if the creator woke up feeling extra spicy. No complex geometry, no fancy metallurgy, just pure physics applied with violent enthusiasm. Knights loved them because maces didn't care who you were. King, peasant, cleric, accountant. Everyone's skull was equally disappointing to a mace. And let's be honest, swinging a mace required far less training than mastering a sword. Swordsmanship took years of practice, discipline, and expensive lessons with a grumpy fencing master who smelled like onions. Mace training took about 30 seconds. Lift mace, move mace, quickly toward enemy, repeat until enemy stops moving. It was the medieval version of smash that like button. Then there's the psychological factor. If you see someone charging at you with a sword, you think, ah, a duel. If someone charges with a mace, you think, oh no, this man has given up on elegance. Maces were terrifying because they made it clear the user wasn't there for a good time. They were there for permanent solutions. Hollywood hates maces because they're not glamorous, but knights love them because they worked. No sparkly sword choreography, no perfectly timed clangs, just blunt, crushing, career-ending force. If swords were medieval romance, maces were the divorce papers. If a mace was the medieval equivalent of hitting someone with a brick, then the warhammer was what happened when a blacksmith woke up one morning and said, "What if we made a brick smarter?" This weapon wasn't subtle. It didn't pretend to be elegant. It was designed to solve one very specific problem. Armor made people annoyingly difficult to kill. Unlike warhammers in video games, which are usually massive, shiny, and wielded by shirtless barbarians for no logical reason, real medieval warhammers were compact, practical, and perfectly engineered for ruining your opponent's afternoon. They typically had two ends. A blunt hammer face for delivering the kind of impact that makes a man reconsider his place in the universe. A narrow, vicious spike for punching through armor joints, like someone opening a tin can with misplaced enthusiasm. If plate armor was a fortress, the warhammer was a siege engine small enough to carry in one hand. Let's talk about that spike. It wasn't decorative. It was a concentrated point of medieval science. All the force of your body, your horse, and your pent-up frustration delivered into a single, sharp tip. The good strike didn't bounce off like a sword. It dug in, helmet pierced, breastplate cracked, spine interrupted. The warhammer was terrifying, not because of its size, but because of its efficiency. Knights didn't need impressive swings. Just one short, angry jab into the visor slit, and the fight was over, usually forever. Medieval combat manuals rarely mention warhammers in flowery language, but you can read the subtext. Stab them with this, they will die. Another advantage, warhammers didn't get stuck, unlike axes, which sometimes embedded themselves in armor or bone, forcing the user to do an awkward yank while being stabbed. A warhammer spike slid in and out with disappointing ease, perfect for people who valued speed, precision, and not dying. Hollywood rarely shows warhammers because they don't look heroic. There's nothing cinematic about a knight calmly puncturing someone's helmet like he's checking if a melon is ripe. But, historically, warhammers were the great equalizers, small enough to ignore, powerful enough to regret ignoring. If swords were for ceremonies and maces were for stress relief, then warhammers were for moments when a knight said, "I need this person gone." Now, if swords were the polite, socially acceptable side of medieval violence, axes were the part of the arsenal that said, "I didn't come here to impress anybody. I came here to ruin someone's entire week." And contrary to popular belief, knights absolutely used axes. Not the lumberjack kind that look like they belong in a hardware store, but purpose-built combat axes that were lighter, faster, and considerably more judgmental. Medieval battle axes weren't giant slabs of metal. They were sleek, efficient instruments of destruction, shaped by people who clearly had unresolved emotional issues. A well-made axe head concentrated force into a narrow edge, which made it superb for cutting through shields, splitting helmets, and chopping through anything the enemy conveniently left unprotected. Knights loved axes for the same reason modern people love power tools. They get results fast. An axe didn't care how fancy your armor was, how noble your bloodline was, or what inspirational speech you gave before the battle. When that blade came down with several £100 of combined momentum and resentment, things happened. None of them positive. But axes were more than just chopsticks for humans. Knights used the back hook or bearded axe head to yank shields out of the way, drag enemies off horses, or pull someone close enough to deliver the kind of follow-up strikes that ruined family lineages. Imagine being armored, mounted, confident, and suddenly feeling a hook latch onto your shield, like a medieval tow truck pulling you off your ride. That's what axe combat felt like. Axes also excelled at one very important battlefield activity, destroying wooden things. Shields, spear, shafts, barricades, doors. If it was vaguely made of wood, the axe was ready to end its existence. On a medieval battlefield, wood was everywhere, and none of it survived long around an irritated knight with an axe. They were also economical. Swordsmiths charged a small fortune. Axe heads, simple, cheap, smash-friendly. Even peasants could afford them, which really stresses out historians trying to draw class distinctions. But the real reason knights used axes, they worked on people who didn't want to be hit. Armor could deflect, shields could block, swords could miss, but axes, they found ways to make you regret wearing metal in the first place. Hollywood avoids axes because they lack elegance. Real knights embraced them because elegance doesn't matter when you're trying not to get stabbed in a muddy field surrounded by strangers, screaming in Old French. Axes weren't graceful, they were effective, and in medieval combat, that was the only resume that mattered. If swords are the celebrity of medieval weapons, glamorous, overrated, and constantly misrepresented, then spears are the underpaid, overworked background actors actually holding the entire production together. Spears didn't get songs written about them. They didn't get ceremonial versions. No knight in shining armor rode into a hall, proudly holding up a spear for dramatic effect. And yet, spears won more battles than every sword in Europe combined. A spear was simple. A long stick with a pointy end, that's it. No fancy blade geometry, no poetry about them, no blacksmith whispering ancient secrets to the metal. But when you, refighting in a muddy field, surrounded by enemies who want to remove your head from your financial responsibilities, simplicity is a blessing. The first and most important fact, spears outranged everything. In a sword fight, your enemy is close enough to smell your breath. In a spear fight, you can start stabbing people 2 meters away while still contemplating whether they look like someone who flosses. A good thrust with a spear kept danger far away, which, incidentally, is the opposite of what Hollywood choreographers want. A knight on foot with a spear was terrifying. A knight on horseback with a lance was legally classified as a medieval missile. Spears and lances delivered kinetic energy that could break ribs, unhorse riders, and occasionally send an unlucky opponent airborne in embarrassing ways. Imagine being knocked off a horse so hard your grandchildren feel it. Even untrained peasants could use spears effectively, pointy end, to ward enemy. That's the whole lesson. That's why medieval generals loved spears. Your soldiers didn't need years of fencing lessons. They needed a weapon and a general direction to shove it. Spears also formed the backbone of infantry formations. Shield walls, pike blocks, phalanxes, all based on sticking sharp sticks in ranks so tight that charging cavalry felt like running into a very angry wooden porcupine. And let's talk about maintenance. Swords required polishing, sharpening, and constant care. Spears required a new stick, maybe a new metal tip if you had a particularly violent year. They were basically the IKEA furniture of medieval combat, cheap, functional, and surprisingly durable when used correctly. Hollywood rarely shows spears because they make fights too realistic. A spear duel is quick, efficient, and terrifying. Not the dramatic 15-minute clang-clang, spin, twirl, jump sequence directors love. But real knights knew the truth. If you wanted to survive a battlefield, you prayed your sword stayed in its sheath and your spear never left your hands. If you've ever watched a jousting scene in a Hollywood film, you probably think a lance charge is majestic. 2 noble knights galloping toward each other in slow motion, lances glinting in the sun, violins swelling, and everyone looking fabulous. In reality, a lance charge was much closer to participating in an unlicensed medieval demolition derby while wearing a metal oven. Let's start with the important part. A lance charge is basically a controlled car crash. A knight and his horse would accelerate to full speed, lower a long wooden pole, pray to several saints at once, and hope the opposing knight didn't have better aim. The physics were simple. The faster you went, the more devastating your hit, and the more likely you were to go flying off your horse like a sack of flour being launched from a trebuchet. And Hollywood's lances exploding into splinters isn't false. It's actually one of the few things they get right. Lances broke constantly. They were designed to a solid, unbreakable lance would have turned every joust into a head removal competition, which admittedly medieval audiences might have enjoyed too much. On an actual battlefield, not a tidy tournament field with cheering nobles, lances were even more chaotic. The ground was uneven, the air was dusty, and the person you were trying to hit was actively attempting to murder you at high speed. This wasn't choreographed, this wasn't elegant, this was 2 armored men playing chicken with giant skewers. If the lance hit correctly, your opponent might fall off his horse, break several ribs, or simply lose all interest in the battle. If it hit incorrectly, you might lose your grip, your balance, your dignity, and possibly your lunch. Knights frequently fell, rolled, and rose up, groaning like metallic turtles on their backs, trying desperately to get on their feet before someone noticed and turned them into a battlefield footnote. Once the lance shattered, which happened roughly every 30 seconds, knights immediately ditched it and switched to swords, maces, axes, or whatever they could grab. Lances were one-use weapons, disposable medieval single-shot missiles. Despite all this, lances were feared. A well-executed lance charge could break enemy lines, scatter infantry, and create chaos faster than attacks increase in a peasant village. They were shock weapons, not elegant dueling tools, but high-impact, high-risk projectiles, with a knight bolted to the back of them. If swords were for duels and axes were for emergencies, lances were for moments where you wanted to announce loudly and violently, "I'm arriving." If medieval weapons were household tools, the pox would be the unhinged multi-tool your uncle keeps in his garage, the one with too many attachments and absolutely no safety instructions. Knights adored poleaxes because they combined every possible method of ruining someone's day into one convenient, easy-to-swing package. First, let's talk anatomy. A poleaxe wasn't just an axe on a stick. No. Medieval engineers went above and beyond. They slapped an axe blade on one side, a hammerhead on the other, and a tall, Menel-looking spike sticking out the top like it had social issues. Then they reinforced the handle with metal strips so it wouldn't shatter during enthusiastic negotiations. The result, a weapon that could chop, smash, stab, hook, pry, puncture, and occasionally open bottles. Probably, if the warhammer was a can opener for armor, the poleaxe was the whole kitchen drawer. Hollywood never shows paxes because they're too realistic. When knights used them, the fighting didn't look like elegant fencing or beautifully choreographed duels. It looked like two armored men in a medieval Home Depot, violently testing the durability of each other's helmets. In tournaments, yes, knights actually used poleaxes in tournaments. Fights were essentially two heavily armored contestants trying to apply physics to each other's skulls, while an audience politely clapped. The manuals described techniques like strike the head, strike the body, and strike whatever is available. These are not reassuring instructions. On the battlefield, poleaxes were the great equalizers. They worked against mail armor, plate armor, no armor, too much armor. The weapon didn't discriminate. The hammer side dented metal like it was aluminum foil. The axe side chopped through shields and bones. The spike at the top, perfect for finding that one miserable gap between armor plates and turning it into the gateway to the afterlife. Poleaxes were also superb for grappling. Knights used the hook or head to yank enemies off balance, pull shields aside, or drag someone into stabbing range. If you got caught, congratulations. You were now the unwilling star of a medieval wrestling match, except your opponent had a giant murder stick. And despite all this, paxes were surprisingly elegant, not in appearance, but in design. Every part had a purpose. Every strike was efficient. No wasted motion, just pure medieval problem solving. If swords were art, paxes were engineering. And in a world where everyone was angry, armored, and sweating, engineering won a lot more fights. If the sword was a knight's status symbol, and the pox was his "I am done being polite" weapon, then the dagger was his "this is about to get personal" tool. Daggers didn't look impressive. They didn't sparkle. They didn't have dramatic names like Heartseeker or King's Bite. They were small, plain, and brutally honest, much like medieval life. Knights didn't carry daggers for flair. They carried them because every fight, no matter how grand it began, eventually devolved into two armored men rolling around in the mud like furious turtles. And when you re-wrestling in 60 pounds of steel with someone trying to take your lunch money and your life, you don't swing a sword. You pull out something stabby, the preferred style, straight into the gaps, neck openings, armpits, eye slits, groin plates. Tragically effective. Medieval armor was good, but it couldn't cover everything, or knights would have died of heat stroke before the enemy even arrived. Daggers were designed to exploit those vulnerable little oopsie-daisies in the armor layout. Unlike movie daggers, oversized, shiny, and wielded backwards by people who have never taken a fencing lesson. Real medieval daggers were short, stiff, and terrifyingly practical. A knight wasn't trying to slash. He was trying to insert the blade into a place that ruined the other guy's week. One of the most infamous types was the rondel dagger, a thick, triangular spike that looked like something you'd use to puncture a particularly stubborn bag of grain. Perfect for getting between armor plates and making someone stop breathing. It was the medieval version of a precision screwdriver. If screwdrivers were designed to end bloodlines, combat manuals from the period show knights grappling, pinning, and driving daggers downward into visors like they were trying to force open a jar that refused to cooperate. There's no elegance in these illustrations, no flowing choreography, just raw intent and two men reconsidering the value of chivalry. But daggers weren't only for murder, they were utility tools, too. Knights used them to cut rope, prepare food, adjust armor straps, carve wood, and, in one recorded case, perform battlefield surgery. That's right, the same blade a knight might use to quietly end a duel was also used to remove an arrow or slice an apple. Medieval multitasking at its finest. Hollywood usually ignores daggers because they're not flashy enough, but ask any knight. The dagger was often the final signature on a very violent contract. In the hierarchy of medieval weapons, daggers were small, but their impact was very, very big. If swords are the poster children of medieval combat, and maces are the instruments of medieval problem-solving, then shields are the unsung heroes, the exhausted, overworked, underappreciated employees of the battlefield who kept everything from falling apart. Knights didn't carry shields because it looked noble. They carried shields because not dying is surprisingly difficult when everyone around you is trying to make you die. A shield wasn't just a plank of wood. Oh no, shields were complex, reinforced, and designed with the kind of practicality only a medieval survivor could appreciate. They were layers of wood, rawhide, glue, metal edging, and sometimes paint that probably took longer to dry than the knight expected to live. They weren't decorative. They were the medieval equivalent of walking around with a portable wall. Hollywood shows shields as polite, submissive objects, always lifted to block a predictable sword swing from a very considerate villain. Real shields were weapons. Knights used them to punch, shove, slam, bash, and occasionally help someone meet the ground faster. Picture an armored man charging at you with a wooden door strapped to his arm. That's shield combat. A good shield bash could knock a man off balance, stun him, break his teeth, or take him completely out of the fight before a single sword swing even happened. Knights weren't shy about using the edge of the shield like a cleaver, either. That rim could crack ribs and collapse lungs if you hit someone sideways with enough medieval enthusiasm. And then there's the shape. Different shapes meant different jobs. Kite shields, great for cavalry, also great for turning wind resistance into a full-body workout. Heaters, smaller, lighter, less likely to yank your arm off when someone hits it. Round shields, perfect for smashing a Viking in the face if you found yourself unexpectedly in Scandinavia. Shields were also command centers. Knights decorated them with heraldry, not because it looked cool in paintings, but because on a chaotic battlefield filled with armored clones, a fancy yellow lion helped your friends figure out which side you were supposed to be smashing. Of course, shields broke constantly. A hard hit from an axe could split one in half, leaving the knight holding what was now essentially a sad, overpriced pizza slice. But that was the point. Better the shield breaks than your bones. In the end, shields were the quiet, dependable coworker in the office of war, doing all the heavy lifting while the sword took all the credit. If you imagine medieval combat as a dignified exchange of sword blows between two noble warriors, I regret to inform you that you are extremely mistaken and possibly watching too many shampoo commercial-looking fantasy movies. Real knightly combat often ended with two heavily armored men rolling around in the mud like exceptionally angry armadillos. Because yes, knights wrestled a lot. More than you'd ever expect from people wearing 60 pounds of steel and trying to maintain their noble reputations. Grappling wasn't a rare emergency technique. It was a standard part of training. Medieval combat manuals, written by people who clearly enjoyed drawing pictures of men falling over, are full of throws, tackles, joint locks, leg sweeps, and methods to yeet someone off balance while politely crushing their windpipe. They even included charming illustrations of knights flipping each other upside down like armored acrobats who made several terrible life choices. The logic was simple. Once you're close enough to grab your opponent, swinging a sword becomes about as useful as swinging a baguette. Knights would close the distance, grab armor edges, twist limbs, hook legs, and slam each other into the dirt with enough force to make modern wrestlers WCD. And because the armor absorbed so much damage, they could really commit to these moves without instantly dying, which meant grappling matches were incredibly chaotic and spectacularly undignified. The goal: get the enemy on the ground. Once he's down, he's not getting back up quickly. Gravity is the ultimate medieval weapon, and once he's down, what do? You transition to the chapter your mother told you never to ask about, the dagger. While the opponent flailed helplessly, like a beetle flipped onto its back, the victor would plant a knee, grab a rondel dagger, and start trying to convince the other guy's armor to stop interfering with the whole stabbing process. Grappling also helped in breaking grips, disarming opponents, or simply bullying them into exhaustion. Sometimes knights grappled because their weapons got stuck in armor, sometimes because visibility was terrible, and sometimes because they tripped. Yes, a surprising amount of medieval combat was the direct result of slipping in mud, blood, or the medieval equivalent of banana peels. Hollywood never shows this because it ruins the romance. Nothing kills the fantasy faster than Celalent of House Sparkle Fountain clumsily bodies, slamming his opponent face first into a puddle. But real knights, they knew the truth. When all else fails, grab the enemy and throw him to the ground like a sack of medieval potatoes. If knights had one thing going for them, it wasn't chivalry, noble ideals, or good hygiene. It was armor. Armor was their walking safety deposit box, their portable insurance policy, their please don't stab me today outfit. But unlike Hollywood's clunky tin cans that make every knight walk like they re-trapped inside a malfunctioning vending machine, real medieval armor was surprisingly mobile. Knights could run, jump, climb ladders, do somersaults, and even dance, though not elegantly, to be clear. Armor evolved for one purpose: to keep the knight alive long enough to complain about the battle afterward. Mail protected against cuts. Plate protected against just about everything except gravity, tax increases, and sarcasm. A knight clad in full plate was basically a medieval tank. And like all tanks, the goal was to be annoyingly hard to kill. But let's clear up a myth. Armor was not impossibly heavy. A full suit of plate armor weighed about 40 to 60 pounds, which is roughly the same as modern soldiers carry today. And instead of the weight hanging off your shoulders like a cursed gym workout, plate armor distributed it over the entire body, making it much easier to move in. Knights didn't waddle, they power waddled. The real downside of armor wasn't mobility, it was temperature. Wearing a steel oven in the middle of a battlefield meant sweating approximately half your body weight every hour. Inside that helmet, it was basically a sauna with terrible ventilation and a 100% chance of incoming weapons. Knights had to choose between lifting their visor for fresh air or keeping it shut to avoid an unexpected face ventilation hole, courtesy of someone else's spear. Armor also meant that fights lasted longer, sometimes far too long. Blows that would have turned an unarmored peasant into battlefield jam simply bounced off a knight with a loud echoing bonk that signaled both survival and mild annoyance. That's why weapons evolved to be more aggressive. Hammers, maces, paxes, basically anything that could turn armor dents into internal injuries. But armor wasn't perfect. Gaps existed. Elbows, armpits, groins, places no one wants to think about during combat suddenly became prime real estate for stabs, spikes, and dagger thrusts. Knights knew their armor kept them alive, but they also knew one unfortunate poke in the armpit could ruin their entire month. So yes, armor was incredible, a masterpiece of medieval engineering, but it was also hot, exhausting, and occasionally humiliating when a knight fell over in the mud and needed a friend to help him stand up again. If movies were accurate, medieval battles would have been polite affairs. One knight steps forward, another steps forward. They exchange dramatic speeches, and then they engage in a beautifully choreographed duel where everyone respectfully waits their turn. Real medieval battles, however, looked less like a Norfield engagements and more like a metallic riot inside a collapsing barn. For starters, the idea of a clean one-in-one fight is adorable. On a real battlefield, if you paused to duel someone, at least 8 other people would sprint over to stab you in various places before your dramatic introduction was finished. Medieval warfare was not fair. It wasn't cinematic. It was a crowded, muddy free-for-all, where teamwork meant don't stab the guy wearing the same colors as you. Visibility was terrible. Knights wore helmets with slits the width of a pessimistic smile. The battlefield was full of smoke, dust, and the screams of people who clearly signed up for the wrong career path. Half the time, knights couldn't tell who they were hitting. You swung, you prayed, you hoped it wasn't your cousin. Footing was also a nightmare. Mud, blood, broken weapons, loose rocks. Combatants slipped constantly. Knights fell over so often that medieval warfare might have been the inspiration for physical comedy. Falling in full armor isn't elegant. It's like watching a refrigerator attempt yoga, and getting up was even worse. While the knight thrashed around like a distressed turtle, enemies often took the opportunity to introduce a mace to his helmet. Formations didn't stay neat either. Textbook lines of battle turned into tangled mosh pits within minutes. Infantry crashed together. Cavalry smashed through friend and foe alike. Archers attempted to shoot over the chaos, but often hit people they liked. Commanders screamed orders no one heard. It was a miracle battles ended at all. People didn't die in dramatic duels. They died from exhaustion, dehydration, heat stroke inside their armor, or being trampled by a horse that was equally terrified and equally confused about its life choices. Most deaths didn't involve elegant swordplay. They involved a man too tired to lift his shield one more time. Hollywood hides the truth because it's messy. The real battlefield wasn't a stage. It was an overcrowded, deafening disaster zone where survival depended on awareness, endurance, and sheer spite. So, no, knights didn't engage in noble 1-versus-1 duels in the middle of a battle. They survived medieval combat the same way we survived Mondays, by stumbling forward, avoiding danger, and hoping everyone else was having a worse day than you. If you've ever wondered why medieval knights carried so many different weapons, the answer is simple. Nothing ever worked on everyone. A knight choosing weapons was like a medieval handyman opening a toolbox full of objects designed to solve very specific, very unpleasant problems. Hollywood pretends knights fought with one signature blade, like they were role-playing characters with a strong personal brand. Real knights, however, switched weapons faster than modern people switch Wi-Fi networks. Every weapon had a job, a very specific job. Take the sword. Great for cutting unarmored peasants. Terrible for cutting knights dressed like steel pumpkins. The mace. Perfect for breaking armor. Terrible for reaching anyone more than 2 feet away. The spear, amazing for keeping danger at arm's length until someone stepped inside that arm's length, and suddenly your spear felt like a very long, very inconvenient broom handle. Knights understood that the battlefield was not a polite environment. You couldn't rely on one weapon because battles were unpredictable, chaotic, muddy, and aggressively unpleasant. One moment you're on horseback, charging with a lance. The next moment your horse decides it has had enough of your nonsense and politely ejects you into a ditch. Now you need a sword or a dagger or therapy. But therapy hadn't been invented yet, so you settle for the dagger. Against plate armor, bring a hammer or mace. Against mail armor, try an axe or a thrusting sword. Against someone running away, try a spear. Long reach. Excellent encouragement tool against someone too close for comfort. Grapple and use the dagger against someone on horseback. A poleaxe works wonders against someone with better armor, better aim, and better morale. Run. Historically accurate. Knights weren't collecting weapons because it looked cool. They were hedging bets. You brought a mace for crushing, a sword for stabbing, a dagger for finishing, a spear for poking, and maybe a warhammer in case someone got ideas. If knights could have carried a medieval flamethrower, they absolutely would have. Weapons were also seasonal. Muddy fields made long weapons annoying. Forests made spears awkward. Tight formations made swords useless. And everything made horses nervous, because horses famously do not care about your shiny armor or heroic intentions. They just want to not die. In short, knights used whatever worked. Weapons weren't chosen for honor, aesthetics, or symbolism. They were chosen for efficiency, survival, and maximum discouragement of enemies. The movies give knights signature weapons. History gave them a shopping list. The romantic image of the medieval knight, noble, shining, graceful, heroic, is a lovely piece of fiction created by poets, painters, and people who were not present when knights actually interacted with reality. The real knight was a battlefield athlete, a tactical bruiser, and a walking sauna who spent most of his career drenched in sweat, soreness, and regret. Forget elegance. A knight's life was 20% training, 10% fighting, and 70% complaining about both. Training involved lifting heavy weapons, sprinting in armor, riding horses that didn't want to cooperate, and practicing moves that required the agility of a gymnast and the patience of a saint, all while wearing layers of fabric, mail padding, and steel that turned your body into a human pressure cooker. Knights were strong, but not bodybuilder strong. They were carry your armor, swing a weapon repeatedly, climb a wall, avoid heat stroke, and fight for your life for 30 minutes straight. Strong, the kind of strength that comes from necessity, not from protein shakes. On the battlefield, knights weren't calm or polished. They were tactical survivors. Every decision mattered. When to charge, when to fall back, when to grapple, when to switch weapons, when to retreat, when to pretend to retreat, and when to scream for help because your foot got stuck in another corpse. They fought smart. They understood leverage, angle, weight distribution, and positioning. They knew which weapons worked against which armor, and which weapons to avoid, unless they wanted their obituary to read. Died trying something stupid, and the sweat, oh, the sweat. Knights sweated in winter. They sweated in the shade. They sweated during training, during combat, and during any activity that involved existing inside armor. Their under-a-rower padding probably smelled like a mixture of wet dog, despair, and yesterday's dinner. Yet, despite all the grime, chaos, and bodily discomfort, knights were professionals. They were trained, disciplined, and shockingly effective. They mastered an entire ecosystem of weapons, tactics, and techniques that Hollywood refuses to acknowledge, because the truth is far messier, louder, and funnier. The real knight wasn't a heroic statue come to life. He was a gritty, tactical problem solver, wearing 60 pounds of overheating metal, swinging whichever tool kept him alive the longest. And yes, he was always sweaty. Theodora's life did not begin in marble halls or perfume chambers, but in the rough, chaotic underbelly of Constantinople, a city where the Hippodromium decided destinies just as often as the palace did. She was born around the year 500, the middle daughter of a bear trainer named Acacius, a man whose livelihood depended on the whims of the racing factions. These factions were far more than sports teams. They were political beasts, street armies, and social identities, all woven into one. To be tied to them was to live on the edge of fortune and ruin, and Theodora learned that truth before she even learned to walk. Asius worked for the Greens, a powerful but volatile group known for their brawling supporters and unpredictable loyalties. He kept and trained the performing bears that entertained crowds between races, a job that demanded courage but paid poorly. Still, it offered the family a fragile stability. Little Theodora spent her earliest days behind the Hippodromium stables, tugging on her father's cloak, watching the crowds roar from behind cracked wooden slats, listening to the thunder of horses as though the entire world was built upon hoofbeats. Then everything collapsed. Acacius died suddenly. Some say from a fever, others whisper from a bear's swipe gone wrong, and with him went the family's only source of income. Poverty struck with the precision of a blade. Her mother, left with 3 daughters and no protection, realized quickly how unforgiving Constantinople could be. With no money, no trade, and no faction backing, they were one misstep away from starvation. In desperation, she gathered her daughters and marched them into the hippodrome itself. The girls wore garlands, their faces scrubbed clean, their hair neatly braided, a performance of innocence designed to sway the crowd. Their mother pleaded before the Blues this time, begging for them to accept the family into their ranks, since the Greens had refused to help. The scene was both humiliating and theatrical, the dying hope of a family displayed before thousands of spectators. But the moment worked. The Blues, moved either by pity, politics, or the sheer spectacle, took the family in. And for young Theodora, this moment, standing in the roaring hippodromium, learning that survival depended not on birth, but on performance, planted the first seed of the fierce, calculating woman she would become. If Theodora's childhood taught her anything, it was that the world rewarded those who could command attention. And in Constantinople, no stage granted more power or more scandal than the theater. By her early teens, Theodora had followed the path familiar to many girls of the lower classes. She became an actress, a profession that in Byzantium came bundled with another identity, that of a courtesan. It was a world both intoxicating and perilous, where applause could lift you to fame, but reputation could drag you into the dust with equal speed. The theaters of Constantinople were nothing like the dignified halls of classical Greece. They were loud, bawdy, unpredictable places filled with drunken spectators, political agitators, sailors on leave, and wealthy men searching for entertainment of every kind. Performers were expected not merely to act, but to captivate, to provoke laughter, desire, or outrage at a moment's notice. For Theodora, this was not a degradation, it was a training ground. It sharpened her wit, strengthened her instincts, and taught her the priceless art of reading a crowd. She quickly stood out. Her comedic timing was unmatched, her physical agility impressive, and her beauty unmistakable. But it was her intelligence, sharp, ironic, and difficult to ignore, that made her rise faster than others. She had an instinct for reinvention. One night she might appear as a comic servant girl, throwing punchlines like daggers. The next night she might redefine herself as a tragic heroine, her voice echoing across the stage with raw emotion. Theodora refused to fit in any single box, and audiences loved her for it. But the theater's fame came with a darker shadow. Theodora became romantically involved with a powerful man named Hbilies, a provincial governor, who believed the actress should remain under his control. For a time, Theodora lived with him in North Africa. But their relationship quickly turned sour. Hylas was domineering, jealous, and dismissive of her intelligence. Eventually, he abandoned her, bitter, humiliated, and far from home. Yet this betrayal became another furnace that hardened her resolve. Alone in a foreign land, Theodora fought tooth and nail to survive. She worked, saved, negotiated, and maneuvered her way back to Constantinople. The journey home was more than a physical return. It marked the transformation of Theodora from a performer into a strategist. She no longer sought applause. She sought power, and the world was about to discover how dangerous her determination truly was. When Theodora finally returned to Constantinople, she did so not as the naive girl who had once danced across its stages, but as a woman forged by humiliation, travel, and the harsh lessons of survival. She had crossed the Mediterranean with little more than her willpower, surviving by her wits and whatever work she could find. During this journey, she experienced poverty more intense than anything she had known in childhood. She slept under foreign roofs, walked barefoot along dusty roads, and relied on her sharp mind to navigate dangers far greater than the jeering crowds of the hippodromium. By the time she stepped back into the capital, the city was shifting. New powers were rising, old alliances were fracturing, and a restless energy pulsed through the palace walls. Theodora, now in her early 20s, understood that this was a moment when fortunes could be made or lost instantly. She refused to sink back into the world she had left, the world of backstage corridors, drunken spectators, and the thin line between entertainment and exploitation. She wanted something else, something higher. Surprisingly, she chose to withdraw from the theater entirely. Instead, she earned a quiet living as a wool spinner, a modest trade that demanded patience and discipline. Many believed Theodora had retreated from ambition. They were wrong. This period of calm was strategic. It distanced her from the scandals of her earlier career and allowed her to reshape her reputation. People began to whisper that the once infamous actress had become a respectable woman, even pious. And in a city where gossip could destroy anyone, even an emperor, reputation was power. It was during this seemingly humble phase of her life that destiny placed her directly in the path of a man who would change her fate. Justinian, nephew of Emperor Justin, and the ambitious heir to the throne. Justinian was brilliant, calculating, and utterly unlike the aristocrats who looked down on Theodora's class. He had risen through talent, not privilege, and he recognized the same fire in her. What began as fascination quickly deepened into admiration, and then something far more dangerous. Their meetings, though discreet, were electric. Justinian saw in Theodora a sharp political mind, an unshakable resilience, and a courage that matched his own aspirations. She saw in him a chance to escape the constraints of birth and the possibility of shaping the empire itself. Constantinople buzzed with scandalized whispers, but neither of them cared. A partnership had been set in motion, one that would soon shake Byzantium to its core. Justinian's attachment to Theodora grew into something fierce, unwavering, and completely unacceptable to the Byzantine elite. For them, it was unthinkable that the heir to the empire, a man shaping laws, armies, and the very machinery of state, would marry a former actress and courtesan. In Constantinople, where social hierarchy was carved deeper than marble, Theodora's past was supposed to trap her forever. But Justinian was not a man easily dissuaded, and Theodora was not a woman easily dismissed. The barrier standing between them was not merely gossip or tradition. It was the law. Roman legislation, still heavily influenced by elite prejudice, explicitly forbade men of senatorial rank from marrying actresses. Theodora's past on the stage made her legally unmarriageable. For many, this would have been the end of the story. Love crushed by statute. But Justinian didn't bend to laws. He rewrote them in a sweeping legal reform. Justinian had the marriage laws amended so that actresses and courtesans who abandoned their former professions could marry freely. It was an extraordinary act, one that signaled to the entire empire that Theodora was not merely a lover or companion. She was the woman he intended to elevate to the pinnacle of power. Theodora's enemies were outraged. To them, she represented moral decay, a living reminder that their rigid social order could be overturned. To her supporters, the poor, the marginalized, the women with no voice, she was proof that destiny could be rewritten. Their marriage was quiet, almost intimate, but its consequences were seismic. With Justinian's rise to the throne imminent, Theodora stepped into the public eye, not as a scandal, but as a symbol of transformation. She dressed with restraint, spoke carefully, and carried herself with a composure that forced even her harshest critics to acknowledge her intelligence. She was no longer the actress performing roles on stage. She was the rising political force who would soon shape imperial policy. When Justinian became emperor in 527, Theodora was crowned empress beside him, not merely as a ceremonial figure, but as a partner. She sat on the throne with a regal poise that belied her humble beginnings, and the crowd roared, not just for their emperor, but for the woman who had clawed her way from the hippodrome's dirt to the palace's golden mosaics. Byzantium had rarely seen a rise so dramatic, or a woman so ready to wield power. No moment defines Theodora's legacy more powerfully than the Na revolt. The week in 532, when Constantinople burned, mobs roamed the streets, and the empire itself seemed ready to collapse. What began as a violent outburst between the blues and greens quickly transformed into a full-scale rebellion. Rioters torched buildings, slaughtered officials, and screamed for Justinian's deposition. The city shook with fury. Even the Hagia Sophia was swallowed by flames. Inside the palace, panic spread like smoke through the corridors. Justinian, exhausted and terrified, considered fleeing across the Bosphorus to save his life. His advisors urged him to escape, even if it meant abandoning the empire temporarily. And for a moment, a brief, fragile moment, it seemed the Eastern Roman Empire might lose its emperor to fear. But Theodora refused to run, as men debated, stammered, and argued about exits and escape routes. Theodora rose and delivered a speech that would echo across centuries. She reminded them that imperial dignity demanded courage, not retreat. She said she would rather die in purple, the imperial color, than live in exile, hunted and humiliated. Her words were not theatrics, they were steel. She was prepared to face death hidden, because to her survival without honor meant nothing. The room fell silent. Justinian, who had always admired her resolve, suddenly found his own restored. Her defiance reignited his determination. Instead of fleeing, he planned a brutal counterattack. With the help of his generals Belisarius and Mundus, he ordered troops into the hippodrome, where thousands of rebels had gathered, believing they were moments away from forcing the emperor's abdication. The slaughter was swift and merciless. Estimates claim that more than 30,000 rebels died that day. The rebellion collapsed, and Justinian's rule, once hanging by a thread, was secured. And while history remembers Justinian as the emperor who saved his throne, those who witnessed the crisis knew the truth. It was Theodora who saved the empire. In the aftermath, her influence expanded even further. Justinian consulted her on political decisions, legal reforms, and even foreign negotiations. She became not merely an empress, but a strategist, a stabilizing force in a court full of shifting alliances and treacherous whispers. Theodora had proven that she was no ornament beside the throne. She was its backbone, willing to stand firm when every man around her trembled. After the Na revolt, Theodora emerged not only as the empire's moral anchor, but as one of its most formidable policymakers. While Justinian drafted codes that shaped the backbone of Byzantine law, Theodora pushed for reforms that struck at the cruelties endured by those society preferred to ignore: women, the poor, the exploited, and the powerless. She understood suffering intimately, and unlike the aristocrats, who viewed hardship from a marble distance, she carried its memory like a scar. One of her most groundbreaking changes was her influence over the Corpus Juris Civilis, the grand legal code Justinian championed. Within those laws lay Theodora's imprint: harsh penalties for forced prostitution, stronger protections for women abandoned by their husbands, and improved property rights for wives and widows. She fought to close brothels that trafficked young girls and funded safe houses where former courtesans could rebuild their lives. This was not charity, it was defiance. It was Theodora confronting a world that had once tried to break her, and refusing to let others suffer the same fate. Her reforms extended beyond morality into matters of power. She secured new rights for women to inherit wealth, own land, and resist forced marriages. Many in the aristocracy sneered at these changes, muttering that the empress was overstepping her place. But Theodora did not bend to whispers. She had lived the consequences of powerlessness. Now that she held influence, she wielded it like a blade. Her humanitarian vision, however, did not soften her political instincts. Theodora was fiercely loyal to the imperial throne, but even more loyal to stability within the empire. She navigated court rivalries with a shrewdness that frightened those who underestimated her. Ambitious generals, scheming senators, and even church leaders found themselves tangled in the empress's calculations. Theodora never confronted threats with open theatrics. She preferred quiet maneuvers, decisive actions, and a reputation that warned others not to challenge her lightly. Her support base grew among the lower classes, especially women who saw her as a living symbol of possibility. They admired the courage with which she shattered expectations, passing decrees and reshaping laws with the same confidence others used to deliver gossip. Even Justinian acknowledged her legal insight, often seeking her counsel on affairs of state. The more her reforms spread through the empire, the clearer it became. Theodora was not merely trying to improve Byzantine life. She was trying to rewrite what power looked like, and for a brief moment in history, she succeeded. As Theodora's influence expanded, so did the shadows cast by her enemies. Power in Byzantium was never a stable possession. It was a chessboard where every piece plotted its own ascent. And Theodora, born from hardship and raised in spectacle, understood that survival in the palace depended not on innocence, but on vigilance. Her sharpest political struggle emerged with the Monophysite controversy, a heated theological conflict tearing the empire apart. Justinian's position wavered between diplomacy and orthodoxy, but Theodora, who sympathized with the Monophysites, acted with far more conviction. She had seen firsthand how theological debates could become pretexts for oppression, and she refused to let religious factions dictate who deserved protection. While Justinian attempted to unify doctrine through councils and decrees, Theodora provided sanctuary to persecuted bishops, monks, and dissidents who fled to the palace seeking her protection. Her boldness unsettled the Orthodox faction. They saw her as a dangerous wild card, a woman whose compassion might unravel imperial unity. But Theodora remained unmoved. She believed that stability required not just control, but also mercy. Her palace became a refuge for the vulnerable, and a warning to those who thought religious power belonged solely to patriarchs and politicians. Yet theological battles were only one of her fronts. The court itself was a minefield of ambitious senators, jealous aristocrats, and generals who bristled under the weight of an empress who refused to fit the delicate ceremonial mold set for imperial women. Some whispered that she meddled too much in state affairs. Others feared she would outmaneuver them entirely, and sometimes she did. One of her most striking confrontations arose with Belisarius's wife, Antonina, a woman as cunning as Theodora herself. The two formed an uneasy alliance, mutually beneficial, but laced with rivalry. Together, they coordinated political maneuverings, settled disputes, and neutralized threats that might have destabilized the empire. They were two women navigating a world built for men and becoming its most decisive players. But Theodora's power was never simply about eliminating enemies. It was about shaping the empire's destiny. She negotiated, intervened, and orchestrated outcomes from behind curtains and council doors, using influence rather than force. And whether through diplomacy or calculated pressure, she ensured that no threat, foreign or domestic, could grow unchecked. In a world where emperors ruled with armies, Theodora ruled with strategy, and it was becoming clear to everyone the empire had two sovereigns, and neither could be ignored. By the mid-540s, Theodora's strength, the same iron force that had carried her from the hippodrome's dirt floors to the gleaming throne, began to fade. Illness crept into her life with the quiet persistence of an enemy who knew it could not defeat her in open combat. Most historians believe she suffered from breast cancer, a condition Byzantine medicine could neither cure nor fully comprehend. Yet, even as her body weakened, her will did not. The palace noticed the change first. Days once filled with strategy, meetings, petitions, legal consultations, and religious negotiations slowly shrank into shorter windows of energy. Servants whispered as they watched her rise with unmistakable effort. Court rivals hoped her decline might weaken the imperial household, but they underestimated how fiercely she clung to responsibility. Theodora had spent her entire existence refusing to be defined by circumstance, and she would not begin now. Justinian, often consumed by the demands of the empire, grew increasingly concerned. Their marriage, once the gossip of Constantinople, had matured into a quiet but profound partnership. The emperor sought her counsel on matters large and small, and even as illness strained her voice, her advice continued to shape the empire's decisions. Whether discussing tax reforms, church disputes, or foreign campaigns, Justinian still leaned toward his wife's judgment, a testament to how deeply he trusted her political instincts. Theodora's final years became a race against time. She worked relentlessly to secure her reforms, strengthen her alliances, and shield vulnerable groups who depended on her protection. She ensured the safety of Monophysite leaders, expanded aid networks for women at risk, and quietly positioned allies within key offices. She understood that when she was gone, Her enemies would try to reverse everything she had built, and she was determined to deny them that victory. Outside the palace, the empire mirrored her struggle. Plagues, wars, and rebellions rattled the Eastern Roman world. But Justinian's administration held together, largely because Theodora had learned how to stabilize chaos. Her presence acted as a counterweight to Justinian's relentless ambition, grounding his policies and tempering his impulses. On June 28, 548, Theodora died at roughly 48 years old. Justinian was devastated. The empire mourned a woman who had risen from poverty to become one of the most influential figures Byzantium had ever seen. Even her enemies, though relieved, could not deny her brilliance. Theodora had reshaped the empire, and she had done it on her own terms. Theodora's death did not end her influence. It ignited a new era of debate, fascination, and reinterpretation. Even in death, she refused to fit neatly into the roles her enemies had crafted for her. To the aristocrats who despised her rise, she remained the scandalous former actress who had climbed too high. To the poor, the powerless, and the forgotten, she was a symbol of defiance, proof that birth did not dictate destiny. And to Justinian, she was irreplaceable, his partner in governance, his advisor in crisis, and the quiet force that anchored his increasingly ambitious vision for the empire. In the years after she passed, Justinian continued ruling with renewed intensity, as if driven by the need to finish the work they had begun together. He expanded his legal reforms, strengthened the empire's administrative core, and pushed forward with the construction of the Hagia Sophia, an architectural masterpiece whose mosaics later immortalized Theodora in shimmering gold and colored glass. That mosaic, still preserved today, captures her not as a courtesan or an actress, but as a queen. A woman robed in jewels, haloed in imperial dignity, holding gifts meant for the altar. A visual declaration that her story would not be erased. Her legacy lived most powerfully in the legal reforms she championed. Women throughout the empire would benefit from the protections she insisted on: rights in marriage, property, inheritance, and freedom from exploitation. These were not minor footnotes in Byzantine law. They were shifts in the social foundation of the empire. Long after her enemies' names faded from records, Theodora's reforms endured in the legal traditions that shaped Europe and the Near East for centuries. But perhaps her greatest legacy was the audacity of her life itself. She had risen from the lowest rung of Byzantine society, a world where actresses were considered barely above beggars, and carved out a place not just beside the emperor, but in the machinery of imperial power. Her story became a challenge to the rigid hierarchies of her time, a reminder that intelligence, resilience, and courage could outmaneuver privilege. Even today, historians debate her motives, her morality, and her influence, but what none can deny is her impact. Theodora's life was a storm, fierce, unpredictable, and transformative. She forced Byzantium to confront its own prejudices, reshaped its laws, and etched her name into its foundations. And though centuries have passed, her shadow still stretches across history, a reminder that greatness can rise from anywhere, and that power, once taken, can redefine an empire. Saladin and Richard the Lionheart entered history from opposite ends of the cultural world, yet both were shaped from childhood to become the kind of men whose names would echo across continents. Saladin was born in 1137 in the fortress town of Tritrit, a place of hard stone, disciplined households, and the ever-present weight of military duty. His Kurdish family belonged to a tradition of commanders and administrators who served the great dynasties of the Islamic world. From a young age, he was surrounded not only by warriors, but by scholars discussing law, philosophy, and strategy. His earliest lessons were not in bloodshed, but in patience, justice, and the idea that power meant responsibility before glory. Richard's childhood unfolded in a world that looked nothing like Saladin's. Born in 1157 at Beaumont Palace in Oxford, he grew up in the swirling drama of the Angevin Empire, a turbulent fusion of French and English politics held together only by the iron will of his parents, Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Courts echoed with treaters singing tales of heroic knights, holy quests, and glorious battles. Where Saladin learned restraint, Richard learned pageantry. Where Saladin absorbed quiet strategy, Richard absorbed fire and spectacle. By age 16, Richard led armies. By 22, he was feared across France. His reputation was built on bold charges, fearless assaults, and a charisma that made knights rally instinctively to his banner. Yet, even in their differences, the threads of destiny were pulling them toward the same stage. As the Crusader states in the Levant staggered under weak leadership and constant infighting, a new force was rising in the Muslim world. Saladin, once unsure of military life, discovered his own brilliance. As he served under his uncle Shahrukh, he learned the value of unity and began the impossible task of bringing Syria, Egypt, and Mesopotamia under one cause, a cause greater than conquest, the recovery of Jerusalem. Meanwhile, across Europe, the call of crusade ignited Richard's ambition, a king who cared more for the sword than the throne. He saw the Crusades not simply as religious duty, but as the greatest proving ground a knight could ever dream of. It was where legends were made, and Richard intended to carve his name among them. Two men, raised in opposite cultures, guided by opposite philosophies, were being drawn toward a single battlefield, not merely as enemies, but as rivals shaped by fate, destined to clash, destined to respect, destined to remember each other forever. Before Saladin could ever meet Richard on the battlefield, he first had to confront an enemy far more dangerous than any crusader: division within the Muslim world itself. The Middle East of the 12th century was a fractured landscape of rival emirs, competing dynasties, and political distrust. Egypt struggled under the failing Fatimid Caliphate. Syria was split among quarreling princes, and Jerusalem remained in Crusader hands, weakened but still defiant. No single ruler could unite these territories. Few even dared to imagine it. But Saladin, quiet in demeanor and underestimated by many, saw unity not as a dream but as a necessity. Under his uncle Shahrukh, he learned the ruthless political realities of the region, watching how alliances were forged with handshakes and broken with daggers. He also learned the subtler art of winning loyalty, not through fear, but through fairness. After Shahrukhu's death, Saladin unexpectedly became vizier of Egypt. Many dismissed him as a temporary figurehead. They assumed he lacked the cunning to navigate court politics. They were wrong. Through careful diplomacy, calculated generosity, and decisive action, Saladin dismantled the corrupt Fatimid power structure and restored Egypt to Sunni rule. It was a masterstroke. Egypt became the financial and military backbone he needed for his next ambition, uniting Syria, Palestine, and Mesopotamia. He moved methodically, taking cities not only by the sword but by persuasion, offering clemency to enemies and stability to regions long exhausted by internal conflict. Each victory strengthened his reputation as a leader chosen not by birthright but by destiny. Still, one prize remained: Jerusalem. For decades, Muslims across the region had viewed its loss as a wound in the heart of Islam. Saladin promised not vengeance, but restoration, a return of balance and dignity after years of chaos. In 1187, at the Battle of Hattin, he broke the Crusader armies in a single, breathtaking victory. The Holy City fell soon after, but without massacre or cruelty. Saladin allowed Christians to leave peacefully upon payment of ransom, protecting thousands who had feared annihilation. His fairness shocked Europe. His chivalry inspired legends, and across the sea, word of Saladin's rise traveled fast. Kings and knights murmured his name with a mixture of respect and alarm. One man in particular listened with unusual intensity, a newly crowned English king who hungered for challenge and glory, Richard the Lionheart. Their destinies were now on a collision course. While Saladin was uniting the Muslim world under a single banner, Europe was erupting with outrage. News of Jerusalem's fall spread across kingdoms like a spark across dry straw. Preachers thundered from pulpits, knights clenched their fists, and kings felt the weight of divine expectation settle on their shoulders. Among them was the newly crowned Richard I, a king whose heart had always belonged more to the battlefield than the throne. Richard did not need persuasion. The crusade was the perfect stage for everything he believed himself to be. A warrior chosen by God, a knight destined for glory, a leader whose sword would carve righteousness into history. He inherited a kingdom mired in debt and political troubles, but he cared little for the burdens of ruling England. He sold lands, emptied treasuries, and prepared for war as if it were a sacred pilgrimage. His mother, Elena of Aquitaine, supported his ambition. She knew her son's nature better than anyone. Richard was born for conflict. The crusade was not a duty, it was a calling. The journey to the Holy Land was fraught with storms and political maneuvering. Richard's fleet nearly sank off Cyprus, and when its survivors were mistreated by the island's ruler, Richard invaded without hesitation. He conquered Cyprus in a matter of weeks, reshaping its governance and securing it as a vital crusader base. His ruthlessness shocked some and impressed many, but one thing became clear: Richard would not be slowed down by insult or provocation. Every obstacle was merely another chance to prove his ferocity. When he finally reached Acre in 1191, the Crusader forces were exhausted, starving, and on the brink of collapse. Under Saladin's siege, Richard arrived like a storm. His crossbowmen shredded enemy lines. His engineers built siege engines at astonishing speed, and his presence alone reinvigorated weary soldiers. Within weeks, Acre fell. The Crusaders hailed Richard as the savior of the campaign, but Richard's victories came with a darker edge. In one infamous act, he executed about 2,000 Muslim prisoners after negotiations with Saladin stalled. To Richard, it was a strategic necessity. To Saladin, it was a grave wound. Yet, even in this moment of brutality, Saladin did not retaliate with equal cruelty. He responded with discipline, restraint, and a refusal to be dragged into savagery. The arrival of Richard the Lionheart signaled a new phase of the war, one defined not merely by battles, but by reputation. Each man now studied the other from across the battlefield, recognizing a rival worthy of respect. The fall of Acre marked the moment Saladin and Richard the Lionheart truly became aware of each other as rivals, not abstract threats, but living, thinking opponents whose decisions could alter the fate of empires. The months that followed were a series of chess moves played with armies, ambushes, negotiations, and feints. Neither man underestimated the other. Both prepared, as if facing an equal force of nature. Richard's march south along the coast toward Jaffa became a showcase of discipline rare among Crusader armies. He drilled his men relentlessly, assigning crossbowmen to march in tight formations behind pieces, while knights rode in controlled ranks, a stark contrast to the chaotic charges that had doomed previous Crusader forces. Richard understood Saladin far better than most Western leaders. He knew the Sultan preferred speed, ambush, and harassment. He prepared accordingly. Saladin, for his part, watched Richard with growing respect. The Lionheart was unlike the European kings he had defeated before. Richard anticipated ambushes, reorganized his columns with mathematical precision, and punished disorder ruthlessly. Saladin tested him with hit-and-run tactics, showers of arrows, and probing attacks meant to break the Crusader march. Richard didn't budge. If anything, he seemed to thrive under pressure, issuing commands from horseback with a confidence Saladin recognized in himself. Their first major confrontation exploded at the Battle of Ars in September 1191. Saladin's forces struck repeatedly at the Crusader flanks, hoping to provoke a disorderly charge. For hours, Richard held his knights back, absorbing wave after wave of attack, while his infantry maintained the shielded march. It was a feat of iron discipline. Saladin pressed harder, ordering his cavalry to concentrate their blows. Dust rose, arrows fell like rain, and the heat of the day scorched both armies. Finally, when the pressure reached its breaking point, Richard unleashed his knights. The charge crashed through Saladin's lines with devastating force, scattering the Sultan's troops and securing a decisive Crusader victory. Yet Saladin's army did not collapse. He executed a disciplined retreat, preventing the battle from turning into a massacre. It was a loss, but not a defeat of spirit. And remarkably, neither leader emerged from Arsuf with hatred. Instead, the battle forged a deeper, almost unsettling mutual respect. Saladin admired Richard's brilliance and courage. Richard marveled at Saladin's resilience and composure under fire. The war was far from over, but something rare had taken root, admiration growing in the ashes of battle. After Ars, the war settled into a strange rhythm, one shaped as much by diplomacy as by battle. Richard and Saladin were enemies. Instead, they circled each other like two master swordsmen who understood that victory required more than brute force. Their campaigns became a mixture of sieges, negotiations, alliances, betrayals, and surprisingly, an ongoing exchange of letters filled with dignity and admiration. Richard marched toward Jerusalem, but stopped short. He understood that even if he captured the holy city, he couldn't hold it. Saladin's cavalry dominated the countryside, and Richard's supply lines would crumble the moment he advanced too far inland. Saladin, studying Richard's hesitation, recognized a strategic mind equal to his own. Neither leader moved recklessly, and this slow, calculating approach forged a curious respect between them. Their correspondence became legendary. Richard praised Saladin's honor, calling him wise and noble, terms almost unheard of between opposing commanders during the Crusades. Saladin, in turn, praised Richard's courage, acknowledging him as the greatest knight of Christendom. These were not empty compliments. Each man saw in the other a reflection of the virtues he held most dear. Their respect was not limited to words. It expressed itself in acts that astonished the world. When Richard fell gravely ill, Saladin sent him fresh fruit, snow, to cool his fever, and a personal physician. When Saladin's brother, Aladel, negotiated with Richard, the English king playfully proposed that Aladel marry Richard's sister, Joanna, an impossible union, but one that symbolized the strange closeness forming between the two sides. Yet, even in this atmosphere of courtesy, the war's brutality never disappeared. Richard executed prisoners at Acre. Saladin struck back in other battles. Each man carried the weight of armies and faiths on his shoulders. But even when the war demanded harshness, neither allowed cruelty to dominate his character. What made their relationship extraordinary was that their respect did not weaken their resolve. It strengthened it. Each wanted to defeat the other on terms worthy of honor, not through treachery or chance, but through decisive action. In a war marked by ideological hatred, Richard and Saladin forged something almost unimaginable, a rivalry built on dignity. And as negotiations dragged on and armies maneuvered across the scorched Levant, one thing became clear. Destiny had not brought these two men together to destroy each other quickly. It had brought them together to test the limits of honor itself. The march toward Jerusalem became the defining test of Richard and Saladin's rivalry. After months of maneuvering across the Levant, the holy city stood like a shimmering prize on the horizon, close enough to tempt ambition, yet distant enough to destroy the reckless. Richard knew taking Jerusalem would immortalize him. Saladin knew losing it would fracture everything he had worked so hard to unite. Both understood that this single city held the weight of two worlds. But unlike earlier Crusader kings, Richard approached Jerusalem with a strategist's caution. Twice he led his army within sight of the sacred walls. Twice he stopped. The harsh winter rains turned the land into oceans of mud. Supply lines thinned, and Saladin's cavalry remained a constant threat. Richard realized a brutal truth. Capturing Jerusalem was possible, but holding it was not. Once he pushed too deep into the interior, Saladin could cut him off. From the sea, his army's lifeline, Saladin watched Richard's movements with equal anxiety. Every scout report, every rumor of a Crusader advance forced him to evaluate his defenses. He strengthened his garrisons, prepared counterattacks, and studied Richard's choices. Yet, he also waited. Saladin knew Richard would not gamble his army on glory alone. That was the difference between him and the reckless crusader lords who came before. Richard's pride was enormous, but his discipline was greater. During these tense months, the strange bond between the two leaders only deepened. Richard wrote to Saladin, proposing peace terms, prisoner exchanges, and even marriages between their families. Saladin responded with courtesy, sending gifts, horses, and diplomats. The war became a dialogue, not of peace, but of understanding. Each man was probing the other's resolve, measuring not only military strength but character. Yet, despite their mutual respect, neither yielded strategically. Skirmishes erupted near Ramlar Jaffa, and Darim, Richard's knights, broke ambushes with devastating charges. Saladin's horse archers harassed Crusader lines with tireless precision. It became a dance of discipline versus mobility, two armies mirroring the personalities of their leaders. In early 1192, the Crusader army debated one final assault on Jerusalem. Richard hesitated. His generals were divided. The winter rain poured. Saladin prepared for a last stand. And then, in a moment that stunned both sides, Richard turned away. Not out of fear, but out of cold logic. He would not lead thousands of men to a victory that could not be maintained. Jerusalem remained unconquered, and the respect between Richard and Saladin reached its deepest point. By 1192, both armies were exhausted, battered by months of skirmishes, impossible decisions, and the relentless heat of the Levant. But fate had not yet finished binding Saladin and Richard together. Their greatest test and their strangest moment of unity came at the port city of Jaffa, where the Crusader foothold hung by a thread. When Richard withdrew from Jerusalem, Saladin seized the opportunity and launched a swift assault on Jaffa. His forces stormed the walls with ferocity, overwhelming the defenses and capturing most of the city before the Crusaders could rally. For a moment, it seemed as if the balance of the entire war had shifted. If Saladin could secure Jaffa, he would sever Richard from the coast and the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. News of Jaffa's fall reached Richard while he was preparing to sail north. Without hesitation, he gathered a small strike force, barely a fraction of his army, and launched one of the most daring amphibious landings of the Middle Ages. As Saladin's troops occupied the city, Richard's ships appeared on the horizon like a thunderstorm rolling toward the shore. Knights and infantry leaped into the waves, splashing through surf under a hail of arrows, charging straight for the Muslim lines. The attack was pure lion heart, bold, reckless, impossibly brave. But what stunned Saladin most was the precision behind it. Richard's small force fought with disciplined fury, pushing deep into the city, rallying the surviving defenders and driving Saladin's soldiers out street by street. The Sultan, recognizing the danger of being trapped, ordered a tactical withdrawal rather than risk unnecessary slaughter. It was a decision rooted not in fear, but in wisdom, exactly the quality Richard admired in him. The next day, Richard faced a counterattack that became legendary. Saladin sent elite troops to retake Jaffa, launching a fierce assault under blazing sun. Richard, armored and wounded, fought on foot with his men, swinging his sword in great arcs, shouting commands between breaths. His presence turned the tide. Saladin's soldiers, stunned by the king's ferocity, withdrew again. And then came the moment that defined their relationship. When Saladin heard that Richard's horse had been killed in the fighting, he sent the English king a fresh one, a gesture of respect in the middle of war. A noble acknowledgement that their rivalry was not built on hatred, but honor. Enemies fought at Jaffa, legends met there. Two of the greatest commanders of their age had tested each other on every field. Desert sands, fortified cities, rain-soaked plains, and neither had managed to break the other's will. Richard could not take Jerusalem. Saladin could not drive him into the sea. Their armies were bruised, starving, battle-weary, and dangerously close to collapse. But their spirits and their pride remained unbroken. The time had come for diplomacy to finish what armies could not. Yet negotiations between Crusaders and Muslims had rarely succeeded. Mistrust ran centuries deep, fueled by propaganda, massacres, and zealotry from both sides. But this time was different. Richard and Saladin were not typical enemies. They were rivals forged in fire, men who recognized each other's brilliance and humanity. Their correspondence had grown warmer, their envoys more honest, and their understanding of each other more profound. Still, reaching a treaty required painful compromises. Richard wanted safety for the Crusader states and access for Christian pilgrims to the holy places. Saladin wanted secure borders and firm control over Jerusalem. Each concession carried political risk. Richard risked angering the Crusader lords hungry for glory, while Saladin risked angering clerics who believed no inch of Jerusalem should ever be offered to the West. But the two leaders understood what their followers did not: that war, if dragged out longer, would achieve nothing except mutual ruin. So, the final negotiations became less a struggle and more a conversation between two exhausted giants who had come to appreciate the value of each other's existence. The result was the Treaty of Jaffa, formalized in September 1192. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims would be allowed to visit freely and safely. The Crusaders would retain a narrow coastal strip from Tai to Jaffa, enough to survive, but not enough to threaten Muslim lands. It was not the sweeping victory Europe had dreamed of, nor the absolute dominance some of Saladin's commanders wanted. But it was a peace built on realism, respect, and mutual exhaustion. When Richard prepared to leave the Holy Land, Saladin sent him gifts, supplies, and safe passage. The two never met face to face, but in their final exchanges, they addressed each other almost like old comrades. The war had produced no conqueror, but it had produced something far rarer, a peace shaped not by fear, but by admiration. When Richard the Lionheart set sail from the Holy Land in October 1192, the coast receded behind him like the end of an era. He had come seeking eternal glory, and though he had not taken Jerusalem, he left as one of the most celebrated warriors of Europe. Saladin watched Richard depart, not with triumph, but with a quiet respect. Their rivalry had ended, not with a decisive victory, but with an understanding that neither could erase the other from history, only elevate him. Richard's return journey was disastrous. Shipwreck, imprisonment, and political chaos awaited him. His empire fractured, his treasury drained, and his health declining. He spent more time in captivity than on the throne he barely cared to rule. He died in 1199 from a wound sustained during a minor siege, an ending surprisingly quiet for a man known for larger-than-life heroics. Yet his legend endured. In Europe, treaters sang of the Lion Heart, who fought like a storm, who challenged Saladin, who carved his name into the memory of two worlds. Saladin's final years were equally humble. Despite ruling an empire larger than any seen in the region since the early Caliphs, he lived simply, giving away vast portions of his wealth to charity. When he died in 1193, just months after Richard's departure, he was so generous that there was barely enough money left to cover his funeral. His soldiers carried his sword before the procession, while a herald shouted to the streets of Damascus, "Here is Saladin, conqueror of kingdoms, who leaves this world with nothing but faith." What binds Richard and Saladin together is not the war they fought, but the way they fought it. Both men lived in an age of brutality, yet they forged a rivalry built on admiration rather than hatred. Their letters spoke more sincerely than any Crusader chronicle. Their gestures, the gift of a horse, the return of hostages, the exchange of doctors, revealed a humanity that defied the fanaticism of the era. History remembers them not merely as enemies, but as reflections of each other. Richard, the fiery knight who embodied courage, Saladin, the patient ruler who embodied justice. Their clash reshaped the Holy Land, but their conduct reshaped the imagination of future generations. For centuries after their deaths, Christians and Muslims alike told stories of their honor. Two warriors, two legends, and one shared destiny, to be remembered not for what they conquered, but for the respect they earned from the only rival worthy of it. To step into one of Emperor Nero's banquets was to step out of reality itself. His dining halls were not simple spaces for eating. They were architectural performances designed to overwhelm the senses and announce without subtlety that Rome had never seen a ruler quite like him. Every wall, every fountain, every drifting fragrance existed for one purpose: to glorify Nero and transport his guests into a world where he alone held the power to astonish. The entrance was a spectacle before the feast even began. Slaves dressed in shimmering fabrics guided guests through corridors lined with polished marble, where torchlight glittered like molten gold. Harpists played behind lattice screens, their music soft enough to feel accidental, yet perfectly timed to elevate the anticipation. As the doors to the dining hall opened, a warm rush of scented air enveloped each guest, a blend of rose water, cinnamon, myrrh, and saffron. Nero believed that even the air should obey his artistic vision. The ceiling itself was an engineering marvel, rumored throughout the empire. Crafted with hidden gears and rotating panels, it could shimmer, tilt, and even revolve like the dome of the heavens. From above, showers of rose petals fell in gentle waves, drifting like pink snow onto the reclining diners. Sometimes the petals fell too heavily, burying guests beneath perfumed layers until they coughed or gasped for breath. An unintended side effect of imperial excess, but one Nero found amusing. He loved spectacle more than comfort. At the center of the hall, silver fountains gushed with streams of wine, not ordinary wine, but blends infused with honey and spices imported from the far corners of the empire. Their sparkling flow illuminated the room with a ruby glow. The servants refilled goblets the moment they dipped below full. The tables carved from ivory and mother of pearl were arranged in a crescent around Nero's throne-like couch. From his position he could watch every expression: awe, envy, terror, delight, each one a tribute to his power. Gold-accented braziers burned aromatic woods, casting curling smoke that caught the light and danced above the guests like thin spirits. The air grew warm, intoxicating. The atmosphere was carefully choreographed, a blend of theater, religion, and royal intimidation. Nero wanted his banquets to feel like divine events, not mortal gatherings. By the time guests settled onto their couches, they already understood the message. In this hall, Nero was not merely emperor, he was the god of the feast, and everyone else was there too. Witness his glory. If Nero's banqueting halls were temples of spectacle, his guests were the unwilling worshippers, participants in a ritual where admiration was mandatory and fear was unavoidable. Invitations to Nero Unc's feasts were coveted, yes, but also dreaded. They were golden summons that promised luxury and danger in equal measure. Senators, generals, wealthy matrons, poets, provincial governors, all reclined on couches embroidered with purple thread, knowing that each toast, each laugh, each glance might be interpreted as loyalty or treason, depending entirely on Nero Unc's mood. Appearances meant everything. Guests wore their finest silk stolars woven with gold dust, toggers whitened to near blinding brilliance, jewels mined from distant lands. Yet beneath the glitter, nerves churned like storm clouds. Everyone knew that Nero's charm could flip into cruelty as swiftly as a torch could ignite dry reeds. A misplaced compliment, suspicious. Too little praise for his artistic performances, dangerous. A whisper or raised eyebrow he interpreted as mockery, potentially fatal. The seating arrangements were themselves a drama. Nero placed his favored courtiers close to him, where they could flatter him without interruption. Farther down the crescent couches sat the cautious and the condemned, men who had angered powerful factions, or who Nero simply distrusted. They ate quietly, hoping to fade into the background of the emperor's theatrical world. But Nero rarely let anyone remain unnoticed for long. As the feast began, slaves glided around the room with disciplined grace, filling goblets with fragrant wine and laying dishes on the tables with ritualistic precision. Yet guests barely tasted a drop before glancing at Nero for approval. Should they sip? Should they wait? Was Nero about to make a declaration? Every choice was a gamble. Adding to the tension, the feast was often punctuated with bizarre surprises. A hidden panel might open to reveal a troupe of dancers, or a mechanical bird might swoop overhead to shower guests with more petals. Sometimes Nero himself performed musical numbers or recited poetry, his expression hungry for validation. Guests roared with forced applause, terrified to be the first to stop clapping. Even the silence between courses felt charged. Every laugh could be misread. Every hesitation could be lethal. In Nero's dining halls, the guests did not dine. They performed. Their lives depended on their ability to appear delighted, impressed, and utterly devoted to the emperor's artistic fantasies. It was not a banquet, it was a test, and every guest knew failing. It could mean exile, disgrace, or worse. Before the guests' nerves had time to settle, the parade of dishes began. Not meals, but spectacles meant to astonish, intimidate, and sometimes horrify. Nero believed food should shock the senses as much as it delighted them. Each course arrived like a miniature drama, carried by long lines of slaves who moved in silence, their faces expressionless, as though participating in a sacred rite. The first dishes were meant to dazzle the eye. Platters of oysters floated on beds of crushed ice imported from distant mountain peaks, each shell dusted with gold leaf. Bowls of figs dripped with honey, scented with saffron. Their sweetness meant to soften even the tensest guests. But it was only the beginning. Nero's chefs were instructed to create foods that no Roman had seen before, dishes that symbolized the emperor's domination over nature itself. Then came the extravagant meats, peacocks roasted whole, their iridescent feathers reattached after cooking, so they appeared untouched by fire. Flamingo tongues arranged like petals around crystal bowls, dormice stuffed with herbs and pine nuts, boar carved so skillfully that its hide looked alive, its mouth stuffed with fruits as though it had wandered into the feast willingly. Each dish was an announcement. Nero's wealth could warp reality. Sometimes he demanded theatrical cruelty disguised as culinary innovation. On more than one occasion, he served rare fish still twitching from the sea, declaring it proof of Rome's power over the elements. Other times, he ordered dishes sculpted into mythological shapes, hydras made of layered meats, or phoenixes created from spiced fowl, while musicians played dramatic flourishes as slaves presented them. As the courses escalated, guests reached a strange state of sensory overwhelm. The fragrances grew heavier: cinnamon, cardamom, rose oil. The heat from the braziers flushed their cheeks, the sweetness, the spice, the constant refilling of wine goblets. It all created a dreamlike intoxication that blurred time itself. For some, the excess was bliss. For others, it felt like drowning. And yet no one dared refuse a dish. Refusal meant insult. Insult meant danger. Even if one was sickened by excess or repulsed by the decadence, one smiled, nodded, and tasted everything. Nero watched them closely, gauging reactions, seeking admiration in every bite. To dine at Nero Unc's banquet table was not simply to eat. It was to submit to his wealth, his imagination, and the monstrous power of a man who believed indulgence was a divine right. Nero's eccentric imagination, and to remind Rome's elite that the emperor's whims shaped their reality. The night often began with dancers carrying lanterns shaped like mythical creatures, their movements choreographed to mimic gods descending from Olympus. They glided across the marble floors, accompanied by flutes and harps that filled the hall with soft, otherworldly music. But beneath the beauty lurked something unsettling. The dancers' faces were painted in serene smiles, but their eyes were empty. Slaves chosen specifically for their ability to perform without emotion. Then came the actors. Nero adored theater, particularly tragedies, and he often forced guests to sit through lengthy performances mid-banquet. Actors reenacted myths of divine vengeance, doomed lovers, or tyrants losing their minds, stories uncomfortably reflective of Nero's own reputation. But since no one dared to criticize the emperor's artistic tastes, guests pretended to weep at the tragedies and cheer at the triumphs, terrified of being the first to show boredom. Sometimes Nero couldn't resist performing himself. He entered the hall wearing shimmering robes, his face powdered and made up like a stage god, and took center stage as if the entire feast existed solely to spotlight him. He sang long, elaborate arias, while musicians struggled to match his wild shifts in tempo. Guests applauded until their hands stung. Whether he sang brilliantly or painfully off-key, survival required enthusiasm, not honesty. But not all entertainment was harmless. Occasionally, Nero introduced darker spectacles. Exotic animals paraded in chains. Condemned prisoners forced to recite poetry moments before being led away. Or gladiators ordered to demonstrate techniques on practice dummies in the dim corners of the hall. The message was clear. Nero controlled not only art and luxury, but life and death itself. The atmosphere hovered between awe and dread. One moment, guests laughed at a comedic skit. The next, they watched a tiger dragged past their couches, roaring with hunger. Every performance, beautiful or disturbing, reinforced the same truth. Nero Unc's feasts were stages for his ego, and everyone present was part of the cast. As Nero Unc's banquets dragged into the late hours, the line between celebration and captivity blurred. These feasts were not simple evening gatherings. They were marathons of indulgence and psychological strain that often lasted until dawn. By midnight, guests no longer felt like honored attendees. They felt like prisoners, wrapped in silk, trapped inside an emperor's fever dream. Wine flowed endlessly, carried by an army of servants who drifted between couches like shadows. Each goblet seemed bottomless. Nero took it as a personal insult. If anyone's cup went dry, and slaves were whipped if they failed to refill them fast enough, under such pressure, guests drank far more than they wanted. The constant consumption dulled their senses, blurring the elaborate performances into half-remembered hallucinations. Conversations devolved into careful mumbling, broken whispers, and forced laughter. Meanwhile, Nero remained alert and watchful, fueled not by wine, but by the applause and adoration he demanded. His eyes scanned the room with predatory precision, seeking out any sign of boredom or fatigue. To him, exhaustion was rebellion, a yawn, a slumped posture, a slow clap. Any of these could trigger suspicion, and nothing frightened Rome's elite more than suspicion from a man like Nero. The emperor delighted in prolonging discomfort. He ordered surprise courses at bizarre hours, tiny pastries filled with rare spices, bowls of steaming broth, or elaborately decorated fruits carved to resemble mythical beasts. Guests forced themselves to eat, no matter how full they were, no matter how their stomachs swelled with food and fear. Refusal was unthinkable. As fatigue deepened, the entertainment shifted from dazzling to surreal. Jugglers tossing flaming torches overlapped with poets reciting verses about freedom, death, and suffering, their words drifting uncomfortably close to truth. Animal trainers guided leopards and wolves through the hall, their chains tight, but their teeth bared. Musicians played frantic melodies that seemed designed to unsettle rather than soothe. The entire room vibrated with tension, as if the feast teetered on the edge of collapse. But Nero's favorite moment came in the early morning hours, when the guests were most vulnerable. He sometimes ordered the ceiling to rotate, sprinkling fresh waves of rose petals. More than once, the petals fell so heavily that diners gasped for air. Nero watched with a twisted smile, fascinated, it seemed, by how beauty could suffocate. By dawn, when the doors finally opened, guests stumbled out, drained, shaken, and silent. They had survived. Not a banquet, but a ritual of power. Behind the glittering surface of Nero's banquets lurked something far more calculated than simple extravagance. These feasts were not only about gluttony or artistic display, they were tools of politics crafted to bend Rome's most powerful men to Nero's will. Every rose petal, every performance, every sip of spiced wine was part of a strategy to dominate the elite by dazzling their senses and destabilizing their confidence. To dine with Nero was to enter a psychological battlefield disguised as a luxury event. Senators often arrived hoping to win favor through compliments and gift-giving, but Nero rarely cared for such obvious gestures. What he sought was submission, a kind of emotional dependence that made his guests eager to please him, terrified of disappointing him. and confused about where admiration ended and fear began. Many high-ranking officials found their careers rising or falling based on how enthusiastically they performed their roles during these feasts. A well-timed laugh or a poetic toast could mean promotion. A moment of hesitation could mark them for destruction. Nero used the atmosphere of the banquets to push political boundaries. He introduced controversial ideas, new taxes, artistic projects, punishments for rivals, while his guests were intoxicated, exhausted, and surrounded by spectacle. Their ability to protest was choked by fear and sensory overload. It was nearly impossible to challenge the emperor while lying on a couch under a shower of rose petals with dancers swirling and musicians drowning out one's thoughts. Nero didn't just intimidate his enemies, he disarmed them. He also used these night-long gatherings to test loyalties. He watched how closely guests listened to his speeches about art, or how passionately they praised his lyre performances. He noted who whispered to whom during the feast, who avoided eye contact, who appeared uncomfortable when he recited poetry about betrayal or revenge. Sometimes he planted actors among the guests, disguised as aristocrats, tasked with initiating conversations and reporting back to him afterward. A banquet could also be a prelude to humiliation. Nero occasionally called out a senator to perform on the spot, to dance, to sing, to debate philosophy, knowing full well that such demands stripped away dignity. The audience, trapped in their couches, had no choice but to cheer. The chosen victim had no choice but to obey. Nero's laughter afterward often decided their political fate. In this twisted theater of power, food was merely the bait. The real feast was Nero's delight in watching Rome's elite swallow their pride, their dignity, and their fear, one course at a time. As Nero's reign progressed, his banquets grew darker, not simply decadent or theatrical, but tinged with paranoia so thick that guests felt it in every sip of wine. Once a stage for spectacle, the dining hall slowly transformed into a place where danger drifted as freely as perfume. Rumors whispered through Rome that death could slip into a cup without warning, that the emperor's smile often meant doom, and that no guest, no matter how loyal, was truly safe. Poison became the quiet ghost at every feast. Although Nero never admitted to using it openly, the timing of certain deaths was too convenient to ignore. Senators who displeased him often fell ill shortly after attending a banquet, their conditions deteriorating in mysterious ways. The memory of his mother, Agrana's poisoned mushrooms, haunted every guest, even years later. Rome knew Nero had little hesitation when eliminating threats, and if he would murder his own mother, what protection did senators have? Guests learned the subtle art of survival. They watched their cups constantly, waited for others to taste dishes first, and prayed the food tasters Nero supplied were not part of the performance. A single drop of hesitation could ruin a man. Too eager, and Nero suspected flattery. Too cautious, and Nero suspected conspiracy. The perfect diner walked a tightrope between delight and terror. Nero's paranoia manifested in more than poison. He seated rivals near exotic animals, leopards, chained but restless, letting them hear the low growl of danger inches from their feet. He introduced games meant to test their courage or obedience, demanding spontaneous recitations or confessions disguised as parlor entertainment. Slaves who served the meals sometimes vanished after a banquet, never seen again, leaving guests uneasy about what secrets they might have overheard. And then there were Nero's violent moods. The same emperor who moments earlier recited verses about beauty might suddenly erupt in rage, hurling cups or commanding punishments on the spot. Guests tensed at every shift in his tone, measuring their responses with desperate precision. Some feasts ended in death directly. A few unfortunate men were accused mid-banquet, dragged out by guards, and executed before their wine had cooled. Others were invited back the next day, only to find themselves arrested moments after stepping into the palace. In these later years, Nero's banquets were no longer displays of imperial indulgence. They were battlegrounds of fear, where every swallow might be the last, and every glance might be misinterpreted. Under the gilded ceilings and rosy fountains, the empire's most powerful men learned the truth. Dining with Nero meant dining with death itself. As Nero Unc's reign spiraled deeper into chaos, his banquets grew even more grotesquely extravagant, like desperate attempts to drown the empire's suffering beneath waves of wine, petals, and illusions. While Rome groaned under heavy taxes, corrupt officials, and political instability, Nero seemed determined to prove that his world still shimmered with divine splendor. The greater the crisis outside the palace walls, the more lavish his feasts became. Nowhere was this contrast more disturbing than during the aftermath of the Great Fire of Rome. While entire districts lay in ash, citizens slept under makeshift tents, and families searched for missing loved ones. Nero hosted banquets that defied all sense of empathy. He invited senators and aristocrats into newly restored halls draped in gems and fabrics imported from the East, a cruel reminder that his palace had survived untouched while the city burned. Rumors spread that Nero had performed on his lyre as the flames consumed Rome. Whether true or not, the symbolism clung to him like smoke. His feasts, after the fire, only fueled suspicion. Instead of canceling celebrations, he intensified them. He introduced new decorations, mimicking the colors of fire, golds, reds, and deep oranges that flickered in lamplight. Some guests whispered nervously that the emperor was mocking the tragedy. Others feared he was simply incapable of distinguishing reality from performance. Nero also unveiled his newest architectural marvel, the Deus Ora, the Golden House. It was less a palace and more a fever dream of marble, gold leaf, and sprawling banquet halls crafted to resemble fantastical landscapes. Forests of marble trees, indoor lakes reflecting painted skies, and ceilings studded with jewels. Benches were cushioned with exotic furs, and silver fountains sprayed wine as casually as if dispensing water. Inside these halls, Nero continued his tradition of overwhelming guests with theatricality. He staged mock sea battles in artificial lakes, complete with miniature ships and costume slaves splashing through the water. He summoned actors to perform scenes of rebirth and renewal, insisting that Rome was rising from the ashes because of his divine vision. Guests clapped with trembling hands, praying that their enthusiasm appeared genuine. But beneath all the spectacle, a quiet horror took root. The contrast between Nero's glittering feasts and the charred ruins of Rome became impossible to ignore. Many began to wonder whether the emperor had gone beyond decadence into outright madness, or worse, whether he had embraced the suffering of his people as fuel for his theatrical fantasies. Either way, the message was clear. Nero's banquets no longer celebrated Rome's greatness. They celebrated Nero alone, even as the empire burned around him. In the final years of Nero Unc's reign, the atmosphere of his banquets shifted from decadent to desperate. The emperor who once reveled in orchestrated miracles of light, scent, and music had become a man at war with shadows. Shadows of conspiracies, betrayals, and his own unraveling sanity. The feasts continued, but they were no longer celebrations of imperial glory. They were frantic attempts to cling to control, to drown the truth of his failing rule beneath rivers of wine and thunderous applause. His last great banquet was remembered not for its splendor, but for the unmistakable sense that something was coming undone. The dining hall, though as magnificent as ever, held a strange heaviness. Even the rose petals drifting from the ceiling seemed to fall slower, as if weighed down by the tension in the air. Guests reclined in their jeweled couches with stiff smiles, careful not to let their eyes betray the terror rising across the empire. Rebellions in the provinces, mutiny in the legions, whispers of senators plotting in dark corners of Rome. Nero tried to distract them with extravagance. He summoned musicians, dancers, and poets, demanding they perform with manic intensity. He sang himself, his voice trembling not with passion, but with the strain of a man trying too hard to convince the world and himself that he still commanded its devotion. Sweat glistened on his brow beneath the glow of thousands of lamps. His laughter came too loudly, his gestures too sharply. Gone was the smooth confidence of earlier years. In its place stood a paranoid monarch who knew the walls were closing in when the first course arrived, a grotesquely over-decorated phoenix-shaped dish. Many guests could barely swallow. They had heard the rumors, Galba's rebellion, the Taurian Guard shifting loyalties, the Senate sharpening its knives. Every toast tasted like poison. Every performance sounded like a funeral dirge. For the first time, Nero seemed aware of the fear in the room. His gaze flickered from face to face, searching for loyalty he no longer believed existed. Even his closest favorites avoided his eyes. The illusion of worship had shattered. The emperor was performing only for himself. Before dawn, he abruptly ended the feast and vanished into the palace corridors. Within days, Rome rose against him. Days later, Nero fled and died alone, without crown, without music, without the applause he once demanded, like oxygen. His banquets, once symbols of wealth, power, and artistic obsession, became remembered as warnings. Warnings of how excess becomes madness, how spectacle becomes tyranny, and how even emperors who feast like gods can fall like mortals.